so, behavioral data science lab. We may be the slightly old ones out. We are actually machine learners and modelers. So what we do in the behavioral data science lab is that we build mathematical models. Now, before you jump out and kick us out, what we do is the following. So this schema is going to very briefly present it. Whenever we take actions online, things like whenever we take actions online, things like you share a piece of content with your friends on online social media, or you retweet a piece of content, we take what is called atomic level actions, like those little guys over there. These actions tend to be visible only to the people in our immediate neighborhood, and due to privacy reasons, they are not propagated usually outside of it. However, when we look in collective, when we measure, when we count them, we obtain what is called collective level measures, things like popularity, virality, or simply figuring out what is catching up. Now, what we do at the Behavioral Data Science Lab, we build the simplest models, theoretical models, that act at the atomic level, which in aggregate give rise to the phenomena that we observe in the data. Now, why do we do this? Well, first of all, because it's cool and it's a lot of math and we enjoy it, but also because it allows us to take upon activities, take upon novel societal problems. Like, for example, we've seen the rise of social bots in later democratic processes like elections, but we've also seen troll factories or the influence of troll factories, and we heard a bit in the previous presentation. Also, we take upon things like the propagation of hate speech or the spread of disinformation. Now, we do this together with collaborators and funders. We are leading the Department of Home Affairs' newest $1 million investment into understanding the spread of misinformation and disinformation in the online environment. Also, we are funded and work closely with the DSPG group under the Modeling Under the Gray Zone program. Thank you so much to all collaborators. I think I've spotted a couple of you here in the audience. We've been funded by Facebook Research to look at the propagation of hate speech in the social media. So we've been active in this space for quite a bit. Now, today we're going to take a deep dive into ideology detection, basically looking for extremist behavior. And before I hand it over to Rohit, ideology, the way we understand it here, can be either the typical political ideology, where we split between the left and the right on a number of dimensions, such as collectivism, division of health, or class division. But we're also looking for more novel phenomena, such as the spread of far-right activity in the online environment. And with this, I'm just going to give it over to Rohit now.
Thanks, Andre. So our work has three main contributions. One, we have a large-scale automatic ideology detection pipeline. Two, we have a characterization of the moral values of these ideological groups that we generate. And finally, we not only do left-right classification, we also detect the far right with the hopes of stemming violent radicalization. Our work differs from prior works in three main ways. So while prior works often require laborious expert labeling of either users or hashtags, our work can be done in a completely automatic fashion with no human intervention required. While prior works often have restrictive data generation procedures that prevent them from being transferred across domains, our work can be applied in a clearly end-to-end fashion such that it can be applied in many domains. And finally, while prior works often only characterize small samples of predefined users, our work can characterize entire online populations. So in this pitch, we'll have two parts. In the first part, I'll take you through our pipeline, which goes all the way from datasets to labeled users. And in the second part, we'll take you through the characterization of these ideological groups in terms of moral values. So our pipeline can be broadly delineated into four components. We start with datasets, which we conceptualize here as a set of users. We then have ideological proxies, where we infuse some political information into our pipeline. And the way we conceptualize this is labeling some of these users with left-right or far-right labels. In the third step, we have homophilic lenses, where we start to look at the similarities between our users and draw ties between them. And in the final step, we bring it all together with our state-of-the-art tree-based classifier, like GBM, which takes these seed users and propagates the labels through the ties in order to label all of the users within a dataset. We have 5 datasets in our pipeline that we use. They cover hundreds of thousands of users and millions of posts. There are 3 from Australia and 2 from America, and they cover a variety of platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, and Parler. They also cover a variety of social contexts. So we have Quanda, that surrounds the ABC panel show. We have Social Sense, which surrounds the Black Summer bushfires. And we have 2 data sets that cover the US Capitol insurrection. In each of these cases, we conceptualize the data set as a set of users, as we see in the top right corner. We now move to ideological proxies, and this is the way that we infuse some political information into our pipeline. And we do this by labeling some of the users based on these proxies. I'll go through each of them briefly. So we start with hashtags, and the way that we label users from this is we take the majority lean of the hashtags that a user emits. The disadvantage of this is that it requires an expert to label the hashtags. Hashtags fall out of usage with time, and hashtags are specific for the data sets in which they're generated from. Next, we have party followers, where we give labels to users based on the party that they follow or the ideological lean of the party they follow. And the advantage of this is that it can be done in a completely automatic way. Similarly, we have politician endorsers, where we give the label to the user based on the politicians that they endorse or the ideological label of the politicians they endorse. And finally, we have the media proxy. The media proxy is based on a large Reuters survey of news consumer behaviors, which includes a self-reported political lean for these news consumers. It was conducted over a bunch of countries for both 2020 and 2021. And the way that we get the political lean of a domain is we take the average political lean of its news consumers. So we get these scores for each domain, and then we calibrate it with the All Sides Media Bias data set. And the way that we give labels to users from this is we look at all of the domains that a user shares, and we take the average political ideological lean from these domains, and we give this lean to the user. And then we generate a label for the user based on this lean. So for example, here, this user is conservative. The advantage of this approach is that it can be done in a completely automatic fashion. Media slants are persistent through time. They don't change very much. And media sharing behaviors are applicable in a variety of social contexts. Just to show you the relative performance between different proxies and why we ultimately choose the media proxy, what we've done here is we've trained the entire pipeline on the proxies on the y-axis, and we've tested on the proxies on the x-axis. What we report here is a 5-fold area under the receiver curve cross-validation performance for the Quanda dataset, where we can interpret it as being higher as being better. So the red points are the high points. What we notice here is that hashtags, the standard approach to doing this, performs the best. However, it requires manual annotation by experts. On the other hand, the media proxy performs relatively well and requires no human intervention at all. We also see a lot of blue in the off-diagonal, and this suggests that ideologies are capturing different aspects of, these proxies are capturing different aspects of ideology. We have 3 far-right proxies as well. 1 is manually annotated, and 2 are based on this media URL idea. The 2 media ones, one of them is based on mainstream media, and the other is based on conspiratorial or fake news media. All right, so we have a given set of users from our data set. We have some labels from our ideological proxy. Now we need to start to draw ties between our users. The way we do this is we assume that users who are similar in terms of curated lenses will also be similar in terms of ideology. And this is based on the sociological principle of monopoly. So we have 3 such lenses here. We'll start with the lexical lens, and this assumes that users who share language, that's a sociolect or a framing of an issue, will likely have the same political ideology. We operationalize this by taking all of a user's tweets and embedding it using the universal sentence embedder for later comparison with other users. We also have the resharing lens, where we assume that users who endorse or reshare the same people will have the similar political ideology. And we have the hashtags lens, which assumes that users who participate in the same topics of discussion will also have the same ideology. In general, we use the lexical lens. And from this, we have our entire pipeline. We start with a set of users. We label some of them with our ideological proxy, infusing some of this political information. We draw ties between them based on our lenses. And then we bring it all together with the light GBM, and we take the seed labels and propagate them through our ties to the remaining users. So we see how it can be applied, for example, in the Australian context, but given a different data set with a different context, say the American context, we can apply it in a completely end-to-end fashion with no manual effort. Cool, so that was the first part of the pitch, and in the second part, we're going to characterize these ideological groups that we've generated. So we start by introducing the moral foundations theory, which was introduced by Graham and colleagues in 2009, and suggests that we can delineate liberals from conservatives in terms of 5 moral foundations, which each have a virtue and a vice axis. So there are 2 individualizing hypotheses here, that liberals value care and fairness over conservatives, and 3 binding hypotheses, that conservatives value loyalty, authority, and sanctity over liberals. We might also naturally extend this to the case of the far right. So we've subbed out all the reds for the dark reds here. And what we want to do for our first application is test whether the moral foundations hypotheses are actually applicable in the online space. So what we do is we perform statistical tests for each of our data sets and each of the foundations, and we count the amount of support that we see in our data sets. We then sum up over the margins in order to see the relative support for each of the foundations in each of our data sets. What we notice from this is that the fairness and care foundations have relatively more support than the other foundations, but in general, the moral foundations hypotheses are only supported 44% of the time for our online data. For our next application, we would still like to distinguish between the left and the right. So what we've done is we've taken the foundation, vice, and virtue scores for each of our users, which we see as little slashes down the bottom in the rug plot, and we look at the distribution for our ideological groups. So for example, we have the left and the neutral ideological groups here. We take the mean difference for each ideological group from the neutral group, and we plot this as we see on the right. So on the y-axis, we have each of the foundations and each of the vice and the virtue axes. And on the x-axis, we have the mean difference for each ideological group from the neutral group. What we can take away from this is that the left tend to use the language of virtue, and the right tend to use the language of vice. So we have a way of distinguishing these 2 poles of the ideological spectrum. For our last application, we want to apply the grievance dictionary, which was a threat assessment tool to these ideological groups. So the grievance dictionary was a curated set of threat assessment categories and includes categories including violence, fixation, paranoia, etc. And it gives scores to users based on the language they use for each of these categories. So we can set up a similar experiment as we did before, where we test different ideological groups. And we see that the far right tend to use much more extreme language than the moderates in terms of the grievance categories that we see on the y-axis here. So we have a way of distinguishing moderates from the far right, but we should also take this as a validation of why it's important to look at far right extremism in Australia. So in this pitch, we've gone through 2 parts. I've taken you through how we've built our automatic end-to-end large-scale ideology pipeline. And in the second part, I've shown you how we've characterized these ideological groups that we formed in terms of moral values and in terms of tech characterizations. Before we take any questions, I just want to point you to this URL that will take you to our code, our pipeline, and the media bias scores that we've generated for each of the domains that I talked about earlier. I want to thank you for listening to us today, and if you see us out in the crowd later, please come and have a chat to us. Also, happy to take questions now.